Chapter 26. Gillen watched impatiently as the company of cavalrymen remounted after a 15-minute break. He was itching to be away, but he knew that both horses and men needed rest if they were to continue at the killing pace he had set for them. They had been traveling for half a day, and he estimated that they would meet Will's party sometime in the early afternoon. Checking that all the troopers were mounted, he turned to the captain beside him. "All right, Captain," he said. "Let's get them moving." The captain had actually drawn breath to bellow his command when there was a call from the lead troop. "Horsemen coming!" An expectant buzz ran through the cavalrymen. Most of them had no idea what their mission was about. They had been roused out of bed in the early dawn and told to mount and ride. Gillen stood in his stirrups, shading his eyes against the midday glare, and peered in the direction the trooper had indicated. They hadn't reached the Celtic border yet, and here the terrain was open grasslands with occasional thickets of trees. To the southwest, Gillen's keen eyes could make out a small cloud of dust, with a galloping figure at the head of it. "Whoever he is, he's in a hurry," the captain observed. Then the forward scout called out more information. "3 horsemen!" came the shout. But already Gillen could see that the report wasn't quite correct. There were 3 horses, but only 1 rider. He experienced a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Should we set out and intercept party, sir?" the captain asked him. In times like these, it wasn't always wise to let a stranger ride full pelt into the middle of a group. But now that the rider was closer, Gillen could recognize him. More to the point, he could recognize the horse he was riding. Small, shaggy, barrel-chested. It was Will's horse, Tug, but it wasn't Will riding him. The lead troop had already fanned out to stop the rider's progress. Gillen said quietly to the captain, "Tell them to let him through." The captain repeated the order with considerably more volume, and the troopers separated, leaving a path for Horus. He saw the small group of officers around the company banner and headed for them, bringing the shaggy little ranger horse to a halt in front of them. The other horses, which Gillen now recognized as Horus's and the pack pony that Evanlin had ridden, were following Tug on a lead rope. "They've got Will!" the boy shouted hoarsely, recognizing Gillen among the troop of officers. "They've got Will and Evanlin!" Gillen closed his eyes briefly, feeling a lance of pain in his heart. Then, knowing the answer before he asked, he said, "Woggles?" "Scandians," he replied. "They took them at the bridge. They—" Gillen flinched in surprise at the word. Surprise and horror. "Bridge?" he said urgently. "What bridge?" Horus was breathing heavily from his exertions. He'd alternated between the 3 horses, switching from one to the other, but not resting himself at any stage. He paused now to get his breath, realizing that he should start from the beginning. "Across the fissure," he said. "That's why Morgoth took the Celts. They were building a huge bridge for him to bring his army across. They'd almost gotten it finished when we got there." The captain beside Gillen had turned pale. "You mean there's a bridge across the fissure?" he asked. The implications of such a fact were horrendous. "Not any more," Horus replied, his breathing steadier and his voice a little more under control now. "Will burned it, Will and Evanlin, but they stayed on the other side to keep the Scandians back, and—" "Scandians?" said Gillen. "What the devil are Scandians doing on the plateau?" Horus made an impatient gesture at his interruption. "They were the advance party of a force that's coming up the southern cliffs. The Scandians were going to join forces with the Woggles, cross the bridge, and attack the army in the rear." The group of cavalry officers exchanged looks. Professional soldiers, all of them, could imagine how disastrous that could have been for the royal forces. "As well as the bridge is gone, then," said the lieutenant. Horus swung his tormented gaze on the officer, a young man barely a few years older than himself. "But they've got Will!" he cried, his eyes welling with tears as he thought of how he had stood by and watched helplessly as his friend was knocked out, then carried away. "And the girl," added Gillen, but Horus dismissed her. "Yes, of course they've got her," he said. "And I'm sorry she's been caught, but Will's my friend." "You're sorry she's been caught? Do you know who—" the captain interrupted indignantly, for he was one of the few who knew the true nature of their task. But Gillen stopped him before he could say any more. "That's enough, Captain," he said crisply. The officer looked at him angrily, and Gillen leaned forward, speaking so that only he could hear. "The fewer people who know who the girl's name is, the better," he said. An understanding dawned in the officer's eyes. If Morgoth knew that his men held the king's daughter hostage, he would have a powerful tool to bargain with. Gillen looked back to Horus. "Horus, is there any way we might be able to repair this bridge?" he asked, and the muscular youth shook his head vehemently. He was devastated at the loss of his friend, but his pride in Will's accomplishment was obvious as he described it. "No way at all," he replied. "It's gone, well and truly. Will made sure that nothing remained on the far side. That's why he was caught. He wanted to make sure." He paused and added, "They might get a small rope bridge across, of course." That decided Gillen. He turned to the captain. "Captain, you'll continue with the company and make sure no bridge of any kind is thrown across the fissure. We don't want any of Morgoth's forces, no matter how small, coming across. Get Horus to show you the location on a map. Hold the south side of the fissure until you're relieved, and keep patrols moving either side to locate any other possible crossing points. There won't be many of those," he added. "Horus, you'll come with me and report to the king. Now." He stopped abruptly as he realized that Horus was waiting for a chance to say something. He nodded for the apprentice to go ahead. "The Scandians," said Horus, "they're not just on the plateau. They're sending a force north to Thorntree Forest as well." There was another buzz of comment from the officers as they realized how close their army had come to disaster. Two unexpected forces attacking from the rear would have left the king's men very hard-pressed indeed. "You're sure of this?" Gillen asked, and Horus nodded several times. "Will overheard them talking about it," he said. "Their forces on the beach and in the fens are faint. The real attack was always going to be coming from behind." "Then we don't have a moment to waste," said Gillen. "That force in the northwest could be a big problem if the king doesn't know about it." He turned to the company commander. "Captain, you have your orders. Get your men to the fissure as soon as you can." The captain saluted briefly and issued a few crisp orders to his officers. They galloped off to their troops, and after a quick conference while Horus pointed out the site of the fallen bridge on a map of the area, the entire company was on the move, heading at a brisk canter for the fissure. Gillen turned to Horus. "Let's go," he said simply. Wearily, the young warrior nodded and turned back to mount his own horse. Tug hesitated, pawing the ground as he watched the cavalry ride away, back toward where he had last seen his master. He trotted a few uncertain paces after the troop. Then, at a word from Gillen, he reluctantly fell in behind the tall ranger.